We've all heard of the American transcontinental railroad, right? It's hailed as this incredible engineering miracle from the 19th century, this symbol of progress that literally stitched a nation together with iron and steam. But you know what? That's only half the story. Because behind that amazing achievement is a human cost that for a very, very long time was just completely ignored. So let's get into the real story. Here's the thing. This marvel of engineering was built on the backs of thousands upon thousands of Chinese workers. Their contribution wasn't just helpful, it was absolutely essential. And yet, their story was systematically written right out of the history books. In this explainer, we're going to bring that forgotten story back to light. So first things first, you gotta ask, why? Why did thousands of people travel halfway across the globe for this incredibly dangerous work? Well, the answer starts back in mid-19th century China, a place that was going through just immense turmoil. This journey to America, it wasn't some grand adventure. For so many, it felt like the only choice they had to survive.
I mean, the situation back home was truly dire. China was dealing with massive poverty, the aftermath of wars, and these absolutely crippling famines. The whole economy was collapsing. So America, with this promise of work building a railroad, it represented this tiny glimmer of desperate hope, a chance, any chance, to earn money and support their families. This was a journey born of pure necessity.
And this really shows you the stark difference in perspectives. For the Chinese workers, this job was a lifeline. But for the railroad companies, it was just a cold, hard economic calculation. They saw a group of people who would work for way less money, and tragically, a workforce they pretty much considered disposable. It was a partnership of desperation meeting exploitation.
So that brings us to the work itself. And look, the Chinese laborers weren't just hired because they were cheap. They were systematically given the most dangerous, the most life-threatening jobs, all the tasks that literally no one else was willing to do. The price of this great national progress was paid almost entirely by them.
Just try to imagine this for a second. Your job, day in and day out, is to carve a path through a solid granite mountain. That meant drilling holes by hand, packing them with super volatile explosives like nitroglycerin, lighting a fuse, and then scrambling for your life before the whole thing blew up. That was their daily reality.
And the danger was almost, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. To blast away these sheer cliff faces, they would lower workers down from the top in these flimsy woven baskets, just dangling hundreds of feet in the air. They'd have to drill holes, set the charges, and then hope they got pulled up fast enough before the explosion went off right underneath them.
You know, it's one thing to face that kind of danger every once in a while. It's something else entirely to live with it every single day. Handling unstable explosives was just a constant part of the job. One tiny mistake, one little miscalculation, and that was it. The consequences were fatal. And on top of all the explosions and the terrifying heights, there was the weather. They had to endure these absolutely brutal conditions, especially the freezing winters up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, often with barely any protection against record-breaking snow and, of course, deadly avalanches.
But you know what? The physical danger, that was only one part of the struggle. Beyond the daily risk to their lives, these workers faced this relentless systemic injustice and discrimination. Seriously, surviving the work was truly only half the battle.
For doing all this treacherous work, their pay was just shockingly low. A typical wage was somewhere between $26 and $30 a month. And here's the real kicker. Unlike the white workers, that pay did not include food or a place to stay. They had to pay for their own survival out of that tiny salary.
I mean, this chart just makes that disparity crystal clear. While the Chinese workers were getting their small wage, their white counterparts not only got a higher base salary, but they were also given food and shelter. This wasn't just an unfair paycheck. It was a system of calculated economic dehumanization. It was a system that said one life was worth less than another.
And the inequality didn't stop at their pay. There was absolutely no way to move up. They were denied any chance for a promotion. They were forced to live in separate, segregated camps, and they were often the targets of violence and abuse. It was a system designed from the ground up to squeeze their labor out of them while keeping them completely powerless.
So what happened when the dangers of the job turned fatal? Tragically, thousands of these workers died. They died from explosions, from falls, from avalanches, from disease, but their deaths were almost never recorded. Their lives just weren't considered important enough to even document, and for their families waiting back in China, there was just silence. They never found out what happened to their loved ones.
But this story isn't just one of victimhood.
not at all. It's also a story of incredible resistance. Because in 1867, facing these unbearable conditions, the Chinese workers organized. They showed this incredible courage and solidarity in a moment that is almost completely forgotten in American history.
In June of 1867, thousands of them, all in unison, just walked off the job. And this wasn't some small little protest. This was one of the largest, most coordinated labor strikes of its time, a powerful, peaceful demand for basic human rights. And their demands were so simple, so profoundly just. First, they wanted fair pay, the same wage for the same work as everybody else. Second, they demanded shorter hours, an end to the back-breaking, dangerous workdays. And third, they wanted better, safer working conditions. They were fighting for their dignity.
In the end, the railroad company broke the strike by cutting off their food supply, basically starving them back to work. So yeah, in terms of its immediate goals, the strike failed. But what it proved, that was undeniable. Their solidarity, their organization, and their sheer courage to stand up against such a powerful system.
So what happened after the railroad was finally done in 1869? Well, in this huge moment of national celebration, the very people who made it possible weren't honored. No. Instead, they were actively, deliberately erased from the entire story. And this erasure, it was a process. When the railroad was completed, their contribution was just denied. They were pointedly and deliberately left out of that iconic last spike photograph that celebrated the whole achievement. And this social exclusion was quickly followed by official government policy when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which bans Chinese immigration for decades.
There's a quote from our source material that just summarizes the injustice perfectly. It says, "America used their labor, then erased their story." It's a brutal, simple, and painfully accurate summary of exactly what happened. They were essential to building the nation, and then they were treated as if they never even existed.
Today, those tracks still stretch across the American continent. They're a lasting monument to the labor that laid them. The work is still here, a physical part of the landscape, but the names, the stories, and the sacrifices of the people who actually built it, they were lost.
And that leaves us with a really critical question to think about. Yeah, the story of the Chinese railroad workers is one about setting the record straight. But it also forces us all to ask, whose stories are still missing? What other foundational contributions to our shared history have been overlooked, or worse, deliberately erased?